Any fool can make a fortune, but it takes a man with real brains to hold on to it. Stick around and join us today as we're talking about two of the wealthiest families throughout history and their trajectory to generational wealth or the lack thereof. Stick around.
Enjoy the episode.
If you're an investor or want to be an investor and you're looking to create passive income that exceeds your monthly expenses, then this is the podcast for you. Here on the Infinite Wealth Podcast, we combine the philosophies of Robert Kiyosaki's Rich Dad Poor Dad, along with Nelson Nash's infinite banking concept. Welcome to the Infinite Wealth Podcast. I'm Cameron Christensen, along with our co-host Anthony Faso. And today we're going to be talking about two of the wealthiest families throughout history and how they have passed down generational wealth or how they have not. One family failed completely, very sad to see, but the other one was very successful. And so we're going to highlight some of the differences that put them on those two trajectories. What do you think, Faso?
No, I'm looking forward to this, addressing this topic. And to be honest, I'm surprised that we haven't addressed this before.
Good point.
You know, I remember early on when we were starting in with infinite banking, our mentors had talked about, had compared these families and talked about the difference. And so we'd always known about it, but I think Garrett Gunderson put it more to light when he wrote this great book, What Would the Rockefellers Do, which really kind of, I think it informed it to more people, but also shared like how they're doing it.
Yeah.
And so I'm looking forward to really sharing this and how we're breaking this up. We each kind of picked one family that we're going to share about. So I'm looking forward to hearing what your family did. Everybody knows how well my family did.
I've got the Vanderbilts today. Anthony's got the Rockefellers. And so we're going to be giving you guys a little bit of background on each. A few of the things that we're going to be talking about is how they made their money, what happened when the patriarch died.
The structure and strategy.
Yep. Thank you. Structure and strategy. And then also where they ended up present day, kind of where they are today. So thanks for helping me out there.
And then what you can do, right? Because maybe you're not as wealthy as these families. So what are some things that you can do on your level to start getting towards the path of the family building wealth?
All right, Mr. All Thumbs pointing at you. Give us a little introduction to the Rockefellers. What can you tell us about the family?
Well, I would say what was interesting is that they first started their business in John D. Rockefeller started Standard Oil in 1870. And he actually became the first billionaire.
Wow.
Which I thought was very interesting. So he built his wealth with oil, and very interesting story when you really dive deeper into how they made their money and how he had expanded it. I mean, there was a lot of controversy at the time where he was going around and buying competitors. And kind of all he would say is he would just open up his books and say, look, I'm going to give you a fair price, or I'm going to run you out of business and I'm going to buy you for pennies on the dollar.
Dang.
So very different concept, and started buying these oil companies. And then eventually the government stepped in and made them break up into multiple companies. And some of them are like Exxon and Mobil are still around today.
Ooh. Great. Interesting.
How about you?
Throw it to me. Thanks. Yeah. I got the Vanderbilts. Vanderbilts, again, very interesting family. I enjoyed doing this research on them. I actually ordered a couple books on the family. So, yeah, I look forward to kind of learning more about them. But, guys, today the Vanderbilt family was really headed up by a gentleman named Cornelius Vanderbilt. And this is in the late 1800s, 1870s-ish. He got started as a 16-year-old boy. He took a loan from his mom for $1,000. He was living in New York, and he started a transport business. So he got $1,000, went down, bought a boat, and then he started transporting people across the Hudson for 18 cents a piece. And that's what kind of set him off on this trajectory and this entrepreneur mindset. And he graduated from transport into shipping. And at one point, he was actually helping people travel from New York out to the West Coast, but he didn't go over land. He went over sea. So he would transport them down the West Coast and then across South America and then back up the West Coast to California. And then from there, one of the other interesting pieces is that that's really how they kind of got their foothold into, fortune in life. And then he transitioned over into railroads, and he literally sold the entirety of his shipping business to get into railroad. And so he built a shipping and a railroad empire, and that's how the family amassed their wealth. And in Cornelius's lifetime, he went from literally zero, having no money, and he amassed this wealth over $1 million at the time, $100 million at the time, which translates to about $2.5 billion today.
What sort of time frame were we talking about?
Time frame? He died, I want to say 60s. So he probably did this over a 40, 50-year period, right?
So are we in the late 1800s or early 1900s?
No, we're not even in the 1900s yet. This is this is mid to late 1800s. So his son took over. I think he died in 1886.
Well, I just put it, to me, I always find it interesting, like, what length people went through to travel or to accomplish things that we take for granted.
Yeah.
Like if we want to go to the East Coast, I mean, we could hop on a plane.
Yep.
Right. And or we could even drive. I mean, imagine going on a boat. Well, we would call it'd have to be a cruise, right?
Yeah.
If we're going to go, but we would be pampered on the cruise. And I just can't imagine the luxuries or the lack thereof. And this is one, I don't mean to go on a tangent, but I got into like the Yellowstone prequels, like 1883, and was it 1932 or something? But to me, the most fascinating thing was the lack of technology and just really how rough life was. When we compare it today, like if somebody wants to start a business, man, you could do it on your phone. People are, I mean, even look at some of these episodes on the podcast, how much easier it is. So to me, it just gives me more respect for the people with the lack of technologies and funding and knowledge that we have now. And they were still being able to build a massive wealth.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing I found interesting was at that time is there's quite a bit of immigration that was coming through kind of New York. And so that's where he had got started. He was moving people, immigrants, kind of transporting them into the U.S. I thought that was interesting. The Gilded Age, there's a lot of industrial revolution that was happening at the time. And so that's where a lot of this money was kind of being developed, which is pretty cool. So yeah, fascinating. What else you got, man? We talked about kind of the families, how they made their money. Tell us a little bit about the patriarch and what happened when he died.
Well, the patriarch died when he was 1937. He died in 1937. Okay. The wealth was $1.4 billion. What I found interesting, that was 1.5% of the GDP at that time, meaning the gross domestic product, like the total amount of value of goods produced in a year. His wealth was 1.5% of that. Now, $1.4 billion is a lot of money. With inflation, I mean, that's really the equivalent of about 31 billion in today's dollars. And so at the time, he was the richest man in the world. And so I compared it to the richest man in the world today, which is Elon Musk. And his net worth is about 270 billion in today's dollars. Almost 10 times as much of the equivalent of of Rockefeller. But one thing I thought was interesting, the US GDP has gone up. So Elon Musk is the wealthiest man in the world. His wealth is less than 1% of the GDP. Another thing that was interesting, and this was probably one of the most impactful distinctions between the two family, is that the money didn't just suddenly go spread out to the family members just because they're a family. They stayed in the trust. And so that means that if the trust, or the family needed money, they would go to the trust. They had that place where they could get capital, uh, and from that, we're all very familiar with the name Rockefeller.
Mm-hmm.
In part is that the kids and the heirs have done so many things. In fact, one of the heirs was the 41st VP of the United States, multiple senators, multiple governors, and also what John D. Rockefeller did during his lifetime, he gave away over $540 million.
Dang.
And again, that is not adjusted for inflation. So they gave away a ton of money, still were able to hold on to that.
Interesting.
So what happened with your family? Once the patriarch passed?
Yeah. So up until his passing, Cornelius Vanderbilt was actually very frugal. He only made, or is noted to make, one significant donation during his lifetime, and that was $1 million to Vanderbilt University. Outside of that, he was very frugal. It didn't give his kids much money at all during their lifetime. In fact, he actually pushed a lot of his kids away from being in the business during their lifetime, which I think kind of lays the foundation for what happens later. But at his passing, he had grown the family's estate to just around 100 million. And what he did is he gave one son $95 million, and the rest was split up. About 5 million was split up amongst the other kids. Yeah, right. So again, he keeps the wealth concentrated on the first transfer, gives it to his oldest son, Billy Vanderbilt. Billy Vanderbilt, in 8 years,
tripled it,
doubled it.
Okay.
He took it from 100 million to a 200 million by expanding what the dad was doing, but then also kind of reining in some of the spending on the family side. And so you see this huge growth in 8 years, and he ends up passing away at that 8-9 year mark. And so great generational success, I would say, in that second one. The trouble starts at Billy Vanderbilt's passing. What ends up happening when he passes is that wealth is immediately distributed to his kids. And then you just see this crazy spending spree that happens. And literally this generation, that third generation and fourth generation, go through about $200 million. And if you guys have time, go through and look these guys up. I might add some of the links that I did found in our research, and look at some of the spending, but it is absolutely wild the amount of money that these guys spent. What ended up happening with that generation is there was this need, or this drive, to be recognized by kind of the elite class at the time, and they were not recognized. And so this spending by this generation was really just to get that peer recognition as being one of the elite families in the United States. And the lengths that they went to get recognized are absolutely unreal. There was one story I'll share with you, is that her name was Alva Smith, Alva Smith. She wanted to be recognized by one of the Astor women, and she wasn't invited to this lady's party. And so she spent 6 years building a house in downtown New York to get recognized. And then once it was built, she ended up spending $6 million. $6 million at the time on one party, and invited 1,200 of the wealthiest people in the U.S. to attend this. And she left that Astor lady off. Right. So you see that happen, and then you start to listen and read some of these other stories. What happened with the other spouses is there became this spending spree, and almost this kind of one-upsmanship. Is she spent a ton of money doing that, trying to get recognized, and then another spouse came in, spent a ton of money building a house in the same area, but also just a little bit bigger. And then you see this other spouse that came in and built what is still standing today. It's called the Biltmore. But again, they spent $6 million at the time building the Biltmore. And so you see just this absolute spending and just reckless spending. The other thing I noticed too, Anthony, is that as you look at kind of this generation in their bios, What it also says is that each family member had very little involvement in the family business. So, second generation, Billy Vanderbilt comes in very into the business. He's managing, he's building it, growing it. By that third generation, everybody's taken a step back and is really just spending money like there's no tomorrow. So, very interesting transition between those two. So, that's worth noting.
Well, I got some comments there, some questions for you.
Yeah.
The Biltmore, where's that at? I know there's a couple hotels, but there is one in
there's
Colorado.
I think that's the Breakers. There's two that were built that are like still standing.
Mm-hmm.
One of them was the Biltmore and one of them was the Breakers. One of them is in Colorado, and I think the other one is in Georgia or Florida.
Okay.
But it was like a winter home and a summer home. And yeah, they're still standing. The other thing that you'll notice, good question, thanks for the reminder, is that generation, not only were they spending money, but they were heavily involved in philanthropic endeavors, which means they were just giving money away.
Mm-hmm.
And so what ended up happening is they spent a lot of the money, and then some of these estates that are still in existence is they actually ended up just giving them away to the state for preservation. So, man, they spent it and gave everything away. It's wild.
But, you know, a couple things were interesting there is that they just kind of shows people are still human no matter what real time frame they were raised. How many times we see people trying to keep up with the Joneses and have that appearances for others, and here these people are one of the wealthiest families in the world and still feel that need to flaunt that. And some of the differences between the way the families handle it, you know, a lot of times we talk about the money,
mm-hmm.
particularly in our space, on how they kept the money together. But in addition to that, what that allows is, or it didn't allow people to go out and spend $12 million for one event. So we're able to close some of those leaks, but also the teaching. Right there, he had some great skills and a great business, and it takes a lot of skills to build that wealth. It does not happen by accident.
Yeah.
But he didn't pass those skills, or maybe only, it sounds like, to one son. But unfortunately, he only survived 8 years, and then that knowledge is just wasted. And I think that I know a lot of listeners here don't have this type of wealth. We do want to leave a legacy. Now, that legacy does not need to be dollars. And most importantly, it needs to be cents, more in financial sense. So even if you don't have the dollars, we need to, at a minimum, pass down that financial sense. And this is an example of what happens when you give the dollars without the cents. Both seem to be gone by the third generation.
Yeah. All right, Anthony, let's talk about the structure and the strategy that was in place. Tell us what the Rockefellers had going.
Well, the Rockefellers did a few key things. For one, they had used trusts. And again, that money had stayed in the family. They also had what's called a family office, which a family office means that we have, you know, financial professionals, whereas wealth management, attorneys, CPAs, insurance, these people are employees that work specifically to protect and to grow the family's wealth. Also, the family had reoccurring meetings to discuss with the family and to continue to pass down those messages, those lessons, and to make sure that the family is on the same page. They also use a concept called the waterfall method, where what the trust would do is when a child is born to the family, the trust would get a policy on that child. The beneficiary, again, is the trust. and then as that child grows, needs resources, whether that's for some education or medical, or to start a business, they could go to the trust or their life insurance policy and to be able to get those funds. And then those children were required to repay that money with interest. And because of the life insurance was there, it was able to protect the remaining family, because if they didn't pay that back for some reason, then the death benefit would be able to pay off any loans. And then eventually, when that child does pass away, the death benefit goes back into the trust. So what's happening is all of this money is staying in the trust. They don't need to go to outside banks, so they're not losing interest to others. The death benefit stays inside the family, and more importantly, it's a reason to keep that family together.
Well said. I wish I had this intricate strategy to share in regards to the Vanderbilt family, but there is a lack of really any sort of planning. And again, I would go back to this idea of between the siblings of competition, right? That was the takeaway for me, is everybody was grabbing at their wealth and what they were owed instead of viewing this as family wealth. There was no strategy. There was no structure that was in place. In regards to structure, I found it interesting that a lot of that wealth was acquired prior to the 1900s, and there was not an income tax, nor was there an estate tax. And so,
good point.
One of the takeaways that I'd like to learn more about is that what that looked like when that was implemented for him. To me, it sounds like there was a lack of planning and really a lack of care on spending, as they had the money, they were sending it. Didn't matter if it was to build this house or to the government. They were just writing checks and not really seeing where it went. So that was one thing that really jumped out to me as far as strategy and structure. There really wasn't. It was every man for himself. But I did want to share one more thing. That was the intro. All right. They didn't have any strategy, but they did have somewhat of a guidance. Cornelius Vanderbilt, one of the kind of messages that he left behind to his son Billy was the quote that we introduced this podcast episode with, and it was, "Any fool can make a fortune. It takes a man of brains to hold on to it." So there was this message, but there was no structure. There was no guidance on how to hold on to it. And so, again, it's just a lack of planning, in my opinion.
I really liked how you opened up the podcast with that quote. Never in my wildest dreams would I think that came from
Vanderbilt.
You know, you would think that might come from somebody else, but again, that's the point, is you can say or think these things, but you need to take action to implement those.
Yeah.
Wow. Interesting.
Great. Let's move on. Where are they at present day? Anthony, give us an update on the Rockefeller family and what they look like now.
Well, the Rockefeller family now is still considered one of the richest families in the world. They are giving away $50 million a year, and the family still has maintained a wealth of $10 billion currently. And in addition to those dollars, we still speak highly of that family. Oftentimes, particularly in our circles, Vanderbilts, you know,
get better.
No disrespect, it kind of been more of a joke or more of what not to do. And the Rockefellers have been more of the standard of what we should do. And it's just, I think he'd be proud that almost 100 years later, after he's died, we're still talking about him.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I would agree.
Now, what about the Vanderbilts? I mean, I've heard of the school, and I was in Tennessee a couple months ago and got to see it. Beautiful school.
Yeah.
Outside of the name of the school, personally, I don't know. I don't know much about the family.
That's because there's not a lot happening, to be honest. Again, if you look back to when Cornelius passed, it was 1877. I have it written here. and that's what he passed on to his son was $100 million. His son, in an 8-year span, increased that to $200 million. So in 1886, they had $200 million, and
Dude,
by
that's a lot of money.
it's a ton of money. And by 1970, there was 120 descendants of the Vanderbilt family, and not a single one had $1 million to their name.
Not a single
Not
one?
a single one. So over, right, less than
Yeah.
100 years, really 86 to 70, call it 90, is they lost $200 million. Again, it's an interesting read. Anderson Cooper is of the Vanderbilt family. His mom was actually an heir to the Vanderbilt family, and there was a custody battle, and she ended up growing up over in Europe with some nannies.
Oh.
Yeah, and then came back. She did start a fashion kind of brand in her lifetime and was fairly successful. But Anderson Cooper is by far probably the most prominent and successful Vanderbilt at this time. So, but outside of that, there's not a lot being spoken about the family. Anthony.
Yes.
Any other notes that you'd like to share? Any other tidbits you'd like to share before we get into takeaways at all?
Well, did you see my notes? I actually have this section called tidbits.
Mm.
As I was going down this rabbit hole, I kind of learned some interesting things about the Rockefellers. But before I do that, what I like to do is, if you're listening to this, you're taking this information. So your family might not have 100 million.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, maybe 100,000 or maybe $100, whatever you have, we got to start somewhere.
Yeah.
So here is a list of 7 things that I recommend that people can do to start. Now, the number one thing would be is we need to have enough death benefit. I know even with this podcast, we're often talking about cash value and building passive income. You know, if things are tight now with your income, how tight are they going to be without your income? So get some term insurance. I mean, it's something that is not that expensive when we look at the value, but if God forbid something were to happen to you, it's going to make it even more difficult for your children or your surviving spouse to even be able to be in a position to have these conversations. We can solve that simply with having some term insurance. Also, number 2, start talking with your family and your kids. Oftentimes I see it, and also sometimes I do it myself. I'm not sharing everything I'm doing with my wife. I mean, so we should be on the same page, not just for, you know, she trusts me to make the financial decisions, but I also think if she knew a little bit more of what we were doing and why, that it might help her make some decisions. And I guess I also need to be careful if she listens to this on what I'm saying, but it's having those conversations with your wife and your kids. A third thing you can easily do is to get a trust. I mean, honestly, I think anybody who's a client of ours is probably in a position where at the minimum they need a living trust that will, for one, protect your assets from going through probate. But also, like we talked about the difference between the families, one of the big difference was keeping that money together. So that trust can allow you to set some guardrails on what happens to that money after your passing. Then the next step, number 4, is let's start building some wealth, whether it's starting a business or growing some passive income. And hopefully the goal of this podcast is to show it's not that out of reach.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the reasons we've been interviewing clients is, for one, we want to get a different perspective about infinite banking from the client side, but also to be able to share some success stories. I mean, some people are doing some businesses where we've had a lot about flipping land, but eventually we'll get an episode or bring Chad back on or what he's doing with his vending machines. And even vending machine isn't the correct term for it, because it's not like you put in a quarter. It's the more the new age of those types of devices. But his goal was to make enough money to pay for his kids to go to school, and he's already done that in 2 months.
Nice.
And so now, but again, this is something he's doing with not a lot of capital, not a lot of time, but it does take some effort. So start going through some of these podcasts and listening and doing your research. But then more importantly, you need to take action. And then as you build this wealth, going to need a place to store it, right? Somewhere that is liquid so you can turn around and use it to grow your wealth. But also we keep it safe, meaning safe from lawsuits, but also from the IRS. And then ideally, we want the money where it will increase your legacy and easily be passed down to the next generation through the trust. And maybe you guys figured that out, but that's where infinite banking comes into place, is storing that money and also getting that death benefit to continue to grow your legacy. And then number 6 would be, we need to pass these lessons down to the next generation. We need to teach them infinite banking. We need to teach them some of the skills and experience that you have. And then finally, number 7, or maybe the most enjoyable, would be is to enjoy this journey. Oftentimes I see people where we're so focused on working and grinding and building, we don't take that time to really smell the roses or just kind of enjoy, hey, this is a stressful thing what I'm going through, but look what I've done and look what I'm building. We need to make sure that we take some time to appreciate the moment. Any comments on that, Cam?
Yeah.
Besides great job? Or
who appreciated the moment? It was Willie, Cornelius II, and George Vanderbilt. That was the generation that spent about $200 million. They had a good time. They enjoyed the moment. My advice to add on to what he said is think long term, right? I got a lot of the points that he has written down there. But again, right, the Vanderbilt family was not thinking long term. It was more reactive. Somebody would pass, wealth would get distributed, and then it's just these wealth eroders would come in and just kind of take that wealth away. I would probably highlight a few of the things more on the don't side. One, the downfall of the Vanderbilt family was really a lack of business interest. You could see that first generation, Billy, came in, embraced the business, got after it, was very involved, and it just continued to succeed. Every subsequent generation after that was more distant, not involved, and you just see this downfall. The other one was lavish spending. I've mentioned this many times, and if you guys are curious on this, one of the best books I've ever read in my life, I read it back in college, and it was called The Theory of the Leisure Class, and it's by a guy named Thorstein Veblen. But he talks about the life of leisure, and he talks about conspicuous consumption, which it's like a disease, right? It's essentially, now they call it keeping up with the Joneses, but it's buying stuff just to buy stuff. And my takeaway that I took from that book back in college is that when you get bored, you spend money, right? And you see this again in this generation, is that this generation didn't have anything to do. They were bored. And so that's what they did, is they just blew through the whole family's wealth. And I've seen that time and time again. So I think being productive, keeping your mindset focused on challenges is a key to production and staying wealthy over someone's lifetime. The other one, personal vices, you got to keep those in check. If you get bored, you're going to find them. And so that goes without saying. The other one, as we've already talked about, is decentralized wealth. As every subsequent generation, again, approach this wealth that Cornelius and Billy had accumulated, and they approached it as, hey, this is mine, right? What's mine? Give me mine now, today. And what I think one of the best things that people can do, especially when you're talking to your kids about money, is frame it in an idea of family wealth, right? Is we have family wealth available to us. If we treat it appropriately, it's going to continue for generation and generation. And along that lines, I'm going to wrap up here, but another thing I've always remembered is do you know the Rothschilds, Faso? I'm sure you do. But Amschel Rothschild was kind of the father of the 5 brothers that kind of went out across the world and started banking. But in his trust, one of the tenets that he wrote in there was that we have family wealth, and any family member can have access to it. as long as you pay back more than what you took out. And so that, again, is a tenet that I think is going to bode very well over time for families. Again, if you approach it from family wealth, like, hey, my kids, you've got access to this wealth, but we're not diluting it. We're actually contributing. We're going to take some out. We're going to put more than what we took out back in there. And so I think a few simple ideas can really help perpetuate generational wealth.
Nice, Cam.
Thanks.
Now, I do got a couple tidbits here. I would like to share that I found interesting. When John D. Rockefeller was 95, his life insurance policy matured, and they gave him $5 million while he was living. Now, most policies we do now mature at 121, but there are some that are at 100. But I just thought it was interesting that he outlived his life insurance, so they went ahead and cut him a check for $5 million. When they built the Rockefeller Center, it was towards the end of the Great Depression. They used no bank financing. Now, I don't know how they did it. Did they do it? Were they practicing infinite banking and taking loans from these policies, like a lot of people ended up doing during the Great Depression? I don't know, but I thought that was interesting. Now, another thing, Cameron, this is going to give you the chills, because your worst nightmare happened to John D. Rockefeller. He was diagnosed with alopecia, which is the disease where you lose your hair and it doesn't grow back. Okay. And he was still successful, Cameron. So there's more to your success than those silky smooth locks. They have sold the Rockefeller Center. I just assumed it was still in the family. And maybe this was me, but I'm like, are the Rockets, the Rockettes, are they named after Rockefeller? It turns out no. It was just a coincidence in the name. Those were all of the real tidbits that I had. We're just end on the Rockets.
Man,
are not
the
named.
Rockets.
And maybe it was me, but
that was good. That was a good nugget there, man.
I thought I was down to something, and
you had some good ones over the years, but I'd put that one up there at the top. That's good stuff. Good stuff. Awesome, guys. Well, we hope that you guys may have taken away some valuable lessons here in our discussion on the Vanderbilt family versus the Rockefeller, and some of the ways that they squandered their money, and a few of the things that they did to preserve generational wealth. So again, appreciate you guys sticking around. Hope you enjoyed this episode.
Go make it a fantastic day.
Take care.
If you like this video, I know you're like this one. And if you want to learn how investors use infinite banking to increase their returns and lower their taxes, check this out. And if you have some questions and want to see if infinite banking is for you, hop on a discovery call with us. Link for that will be in the description.